Hello, my name is Dr. Yabome Gilpin Jackson. I am from Sierra Leone and Canada, and I was also born in Germany. So thank you for being part of coming to listen to these videos to learn about transformative learning or as part of the community. And in Sierra Leone, the way that we greet is to say kushe. Thank you for coming here. So my story of coming to transformative learning and coming to this community has very much to do with my life story. I, as I mentioned, was born in Germany, and my family traveled a bit around Europe when I was a child. And then we moved to Sierra Leone when I was still very young. So all of my formative years were in Sierra Leone, West Africa, where I enjoyed an average middle class lifestyle. I lived in the city. I was privileged to have two parents that were both educated and working professionals and had great lives and great role models for us. And I understand that in that context, that was a relative privilege. However, that's how I grew up. And at about age 19, there was a lot of civil unrest, and Sierra Leone was disintegrating or escalating, whichever way you look at it, into civil war. In 1997, the rebels that had been already terrorizing the country and the war that had already been occurring sort of escalated into Freetown. I was there at the time, and my father was terminally ill. And so he was meant to be flown out the day before everything erupted. And a couple of days later, we were stuck. There were no planes leaving. We finally decided to take the journey out by road. And so my mother, my father, my brother, a number of relatives, even a really good family friend, loaded into a van and decided to drive to Guinea, to Conakry in Guinea. The capital of Guinea is Conakry. So off we go in the van, and we headed north towards Guinea, terrified, and just going and hoping for the best. Thankfully, the drive was relatively uneventful. We were stopped by militias quite a few times. Our cars were searched, etc. But on the whole, we would be searched and allowed back into a van, and off we went. We crossed the border into Guinea, and we all sighed a collective sigh of relief. Unfortunately, that was short-lived, because just a little while into Guinea, and when we were outside of Conakry, we were arrested. We were interrogated. Our van was searched, and a lot of back and forth, and eventually we were held. We were kept overnight. We were kept for several hours the next day, in spite of having a host and a family that was ready to receive us. Eventually, some 18 hours or so later, my memory is very foggy about this, we were released to our hosts and allowed to proceed into Conakry. That was a really disorienting experience for me. Having grown up with relative privilege, as I have expressed, and no human being really expects to have to go through those things. And I was also aware that there were so many other people in Sierra Leone that had had a worse time, and so all of those realities began to sort of sink in, and I began to process what all of that meant. Well, partially processed, because then I suppressed it. 2 years later, my father had passed, and we being my mother and I, left for Canada. We had Canadian family. Part of our story starts there because my parents had studied in Canada in the 60s, and I have Canadian-born siblings, so they were able to make arrangements for us to have immigration status before we left Conakry, Guinea, and off we went. We flew through Boston Logan Airport, and at Boston Logan Airport, we are again arrested. Our papers are looked through, and in spite of them being accurate and correct, we are interrogated over and over again. My mother even still had a diplomatic passport from her days as an ambassador's wife, had been afforded the privilege longer, and even that was ignored. And eventually we missed our flight, and we were handed over to the airline with instructions that they were to ensure that we boarded our flight to Canada so that we do not run away into the United States. We are given security who follows us around for dinner, and we slept that night in hotel rooms with guards outside our door. And we are escorted to our planes the next day, to our plane the next day. So we board and we land over in Canada, where one of the most common reactions to me seemed to be, "Oh, you're from Africa? How come your English is so good? Oh, you're from Sierra Leone. Oh, you must be so relieved to be out of there." All of those very disorienting experiences for me. Because of course, there was a grain that I could understand for why I was being asked those questions or treated these ways. There were so many ways in which I could not understand it, and didn't understand why someone with my identity needed to be treated in these ways. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm a working professional, and I travel back to Sierra Leone every 2 years. And the pattern that unfolds is that every time I return to Canada, I am taken to that back room. My bags are searched, and I am interrogated. Where do you get the money to go back? Why do you go back so often? What are you bringing back with you? And this happens every single time I come back to my new home. I then decide to enroll in a graduate program at Fielding Graduate University. The pattern of being stopped at the airport continues. I am randomly selected, and I go through extra checks with the Department of Homeland Security on the US side. I eventually begin to understand that my identity, who I am in the world, a Black African woman from, unfortunately, those shithole countries, makes a difference to how I encounter my border encounters, whether that is in Guinea-Conakry, where, yes, I was held up because I am Sierra Leonean. And at the time, the Guineans were not about to make the same mistake that us Sierra Leoneans had made, mistake of opening our borders wide, which allowed some of the Liberian rebels to also come through into the country that had helped contribute to our civil war. And so it began to strike me that, the same experience that I had had on the Guinea-Sierra Leone border is now repeating itself, because in this side of the world, in the north, I am considered a Black woman going through the world. And why would I be able to travel back and forth so much? How could I afford the lifestyle that I had? And why did I speak English so good? And as I headed off to Fielding Graduate University, my intention at that time, as I had mentioned, in some ways I was processing, in other ways I was suppressing these experiences. And my intention at Fielding was really to study organization development and leadership, which is what I had been studying and doing, and to do something around large-scale change in organizations. But when I went to Fielding, I met an incredible group of faculty who understand transformative learning and introduced me to it. And they said to me, "Don't divorce yourself from your scholarship." And as I began to engage with those ideas and think about what that might mean for me, I was a little bit surprised that what came up was all these experiences, all the war and post-war experiences, all the border encounters, all the experiences of being treated differently and being, acclimatized into the experience of being Black, which, having grown up in a predominantly Black African country, had not been part of the social milieu that I had to deal with. On that side, like I said, having to deal with the human reactions to war and insecurity, yes, but not myself as a racialized person in the world. And so I began to put those two things together. And what resulted was me entering into scholarship and practice in transformative learning. I combined transformative learning with post-traumatic growth, because I also wanted to understand and tell the stories of all these incredible African men and women that I knew in immigrant and refugee communities that reflected my story. They had great lives before the war. They were professionals. They were academics. They were here to pick up the pieces of their lives, yes. They were also here to contribute. And yet the dominant narrative of what it means to be an immigrant and a refugee seemed to be the negative one that we've all heard, and so I won't repeat here, about what it means to come from those shithole countries. And so I wanted to tell different stories. I wanted to understand the narrative of African leaders who were doing transformative work in the world in spite and sometimes because of their traumatic experiences. And so I went off and interviewed a whole bunch of African leaders in my community and beyond, people who were identified in their own communities as being transformational. I met with them, I interviewed them, I heard their stories. I thought I knew their stories before I met with some of them, and yet I didn't. I was so blown away by the depth of their stories, by the passion, and by their reasons for picking up the pieces of their lives in order to go back into the world, not just where they found themselves, whether that was America or Canada or the UK, to make a difference there in civil contributions, in you name it, in the professional spheres they found themselves, but also to be responsible global citizens. And as many of them said, they would never wish the experiences they had had in terms of war and armed conflict on any human being. And yet they all agreed that it was because of those experiences that they were the leaders that they were, and that those traumatic experiences were absolutely a part of their transformation story. And it became part of mine. As I listened to them, I also processed my story. As I did the qualitative research and locked in on what I came to call resonance stories, those stories from our lives, those memories, those events from our lives that remind us of who we are in the world or who we want to be in the world because of those stories. The things that we hold on to and that move us forward, even when an immigration officer asks me again, where do you get the money to go back? I remember that I get the money to go back because I've worked hard for it, and because I want to pay back the privilege and the responsibility that my privilege affords me in a way that makes a difference in the world. And I want to do that for myself, but I also want to do it in a way that has transformational impact. And for me, that is why I continue to engage with transformative learning in my personal scholarship, but also why I continue to be part of this transformative learning community, because I find here the words to put to the experiences that I have had and the scholarly ways of thinking that allow me to turn that into a research study or into practice, to go out into the world and make the differences that I hope to make. And it's important for me to say that in spite of all these encounters with immigration, with border officials, associated for myself with my identity, it's important to say that at this point, I have successfully acquired my Nexus in Global Entry. So that means that traveling is easy for me. So I'd just like to say that so that the community, as you listen to this, know that that is somewhat resolved for me, and it's relatively easy for me now to travel across borders and around the world. And for me, that's important because I need that freedom in order to do the work that I do. And this story really isn't about those restrictions. It's about what happens based on the social systems and the hierarchies that create these categories of privileged and less privileged, and race, black, white, and you know, the whole world being put into different boxes that ultimately do not serve us. And for me, the work of transformative learning is about breaking down those barriers and creating bridges and creating ways for us to see each other in our humanity and engage with each other as social equals. Thank you.